This episode of Bullet Heaven was made with a copy of the game provided by Zerodiv. Dreamcast shooters were always a thing we wanted to get on top of, but ended up missing the bus before they exploded in price. It has become a little ridiculous on almost all fronts. We sure are glad we got bordered down when we did, that's for sure. But one Dreamcast shmup that has been asked for by our viewers over and over again, more than any other, is Psikyo Zero Gunner 2, a helicopter-based shmup with quite the following. And a hefty price tag.
But publisher Zerodiv may have the answer. Hot off the heels of the 2017 Switch release of Gunbird. Released on January 25th, 2018, Zero Gunner 2 Minus brings Zero Gunner 2 to the Nintendo Switch for under $10. Originally released to arcades on Naomi hardware in 2001 and to the Sega Dreamcast later the same year, Zero Gunner 2 is regarded as one of the finest Psikyo shooters ever made. But wait, what's this Minus all about? Why is it in a 16:9 aspect ratio? And what's up with the visuals? They don't look quite the same, do they? Well, let's take a closer look.
This review is based on version 1.0.0 of the North American Zero Gunner 2 Minus software. A newly announced patch is forthcoming that will make fixes to the game, but will not have been implemented in time for this review. We will produce a follow-up companion video demonstrating the changes in action later down the line. Players have their choice between 3 different helicopters. All 3 have their strengths and weaknesses, but the Hokum is probably the best for them from a pure power standpoint. Each helicopter has unique fire patterns and special weapons, but move at exactly the same rate.
Psikyo shooters typically follow a pretty similar structure when it comes to their gameplay, but not Zero Gunner 2. It was originally released in an era before twin-stick shooters were the norm, so all of the inputs are fairly traditional here. Players move in an 8-directional manner using the left analog stick or D-pad, fire with the B button, and engage special weapons with the X button.
Here's the tricky part. Enemies will attack the player from all sides, and there will be times that the player will need to shift their firepower in another direction. Holding either the Y or A button, players will engage a marker in front of their helicopters. By moving around this marker, players can rotate their chopper to point towards it as long as it is being displayed. Releasing the A or Y button will disengage the marker and lock the player's ship in that direction. Players can also tap this marker button to move the marker further down the line. This allows for a more gradual directional shift. A twin-stick option might have made for an interesting twist on Zero Gunner 2's established formula, but what's here works well.
This can take a bit of time to get used to, but players should keep in mind that this rotation is not locked to a fixed radius around the marker. Players can still move in 8 directions and the helicopter will stay focused on the marker point. When the hang of this is gotten, players should be able to wreak some pretty efficient havoc throughout the entire game.
Fallen enemies will drop a ton of pickups throughout the entirety of the game. Most commonly, green energy pickups will fill a gauge on each player's respective side of the screen once obtained. These pickups will drift off screen if rapid fire is held constantly, but releasing the fire button or even rapidly pressing it will draw these pickups toward the player instead. Filling the gauge will reward the player with an additional special attack for their stock, to a maximum of 6. Small E pickups will fill this gauge slowly, while larger ones do a better job of it. Each helicopter's special weapons are very powerful and especially useful against Zero Gunner 2's bosses. Even on normal difficulty, using a special attack in conjunction with level 3 fire chews through most enemies quickly and efficiently.
Red enemies will drop P icons that increase the player's power by 1 level, to a maximum of 3. These pickups follow the same rules as energy pickups regarding their movement once dropped. Float away while fire is held, and drawn while fire is feathered or released. If a player dies, this power level will decrease to level 1, but many power-ups are dropped in every stage, making for a decent recovery should things go south. With very rare exception, only enemy fire will kill a player.
Unlike most other shooters, colliding with enemies directly can actually damage them by way of the player's rotors. However, players will briefly stick to the enemy they collided with, and the potential exists for players to be pushed uncontrollably into actual bullets. Popcorn enemies die almost instantly though. Using the rotors to kill enemies can be fun, but enemies can still shoot while being collided with, which makes for an instant point-blank death that can be pretty embarrassing. On the topic of colliding with enemies though, it's a little odd that players can hit and stick to stuff on the surface rather than just enemies in the air. This could be an oversight as a result of the Minus version's rebuild though.
Zero Gunner 2 Minus is played over the course of 7 stages. The stage indicator at the top of the screen shows the possibility of multiple loops, but as of yet, we haven't triggered a second loop, even beating the game on arcade. The first 4 stages of the game, as in typical Psikyo fashion, are randomized every time the game is started, making for a mildly fresh experience. Zero Gunner 2 Minus also feels pretty good from a difficulty standpoint, featuring a basic rank system. In the end though, Zero Gunner 2 Minus isn't terribly long, so it also doesn't overstay its welcome.
But here's where the minus comes into the equation. The original source code for the game was actually lost, so it needed to be rebuilt from the ground up for Nintendo Switch. This rebuild adds some things, removes others, and results in a few quirks. Having never actually played the Dreamcast version of the game, we could only do visual and historical comparisons until we get around to obtaining the Dreamcast Naomi conversion. But there are definitely differences between what's here and what's on Sega's machine.
The Switch version of Zero Gunner 2 adds an enhanced 16:9 aspect ratio to the game, widening the playfield without stretching it. But it's also missing features that were present in the Dreamcast version of the game that could have extended players' time with it. Primarily, the replay option is gone, which showed players the best way to attack the admittedly much more difficult game without dying. No key mapping is also an issue, so players can't customize the inputs into a configuration that works better for them, or even to mimic the Dreamcast setup. A forthcoming patch will resolve this though.
There are some odd issues with the game as well. Energy pickups behave slightly differently than previous versions. They will stream out over a small amount of time rather than appearing all at once. This might throw off players used to collecting them at point-blank range like in previous versions. A number of enemies also no longer grow energy pickups over time, and some of these enemies don't even appear at all. In addition, all of the fire patterns in the game are different, less dense or toned down, which appears to make the Switch version even easier overall. The turning speed is slightly different too, though we found it to be just fine. It will be tweaked in the upcoming patch though.
But there's a much more serious issue too. At times, some elements of the game will become invisible, and can only be resolved by leaving the game and re-entering it. Energy pickups and power-ups disappearing is annoying, but enemy bullets can also disappear. These issues are fairly rare, only happening once for power-ups and once for bullets over the course of many playthroughs. But it still happens. These issues usually occur after pausing a number of times or continuing.
This is unnerving, since there's always the ever-present threat that an errant, invisible shot will stealth kill the player. But even the normal visible shots can become very hard or impossible to see behind power-ups or even the glare on some enemies through the game's lighting. More contrast is definitely needed for the shots fired from literally every enemy. Invisible elements and better shot contrast are also slated to be fixed in a forthcoming patch.
The plus and minus buttons on the Switch controller accesses the game's meta options, which includes Zero Gunner 2 Minus's game settings. Players can adjust how many lives, special weapons, and credits are available by default when the game is started. Players looking to skip various cinematic points of the game will likely bring this menu up a lot, unlike a lot of other titles. Instead, pressing and holding the R button will fast forward these bits until gameplay resumes.
But despite all of the issues we found with this reborn title, the spirit of Zero Gunner 2 is definitely still present here. At the very least, when the game behaves and nothing glitches out, Zero Gunner 2 Minus plays well, features fun, engaging gameplay, and can really get even new players into the zone, even on higher difficulties. Even if the gameplay on the whole is kinda shallow, it's still very fun. But what about the scoring mechanics? Or lack thereof? Zero Gunner 2 Minus, like the original Zero Gunner 2, is extremely light on actual scoring mechanics. Enemy destruction is the primary method of scoring here, but it's not the only component to scoring high.
Another big component of the score here is through the collection of energy pickups. Though not as many energy pickups are possible in this version of the game, enough are released to make up a good part of the player's score.
The final part of the scoring in Zero Gunner 2 is collecting power-ups past level 3. Each one awards the player with a decent bonus. Since many of them are released throughout the game, they do add up fast.
The only question is, where are the extends? In older versions of the game, the first extend occurs at 600,000 points, but even well beyond 1 million, nothing happens in the minus version.
Only local leaderboards are available in Zero Gunner 2 Minus, just as in all other Zerodiv Psikyo releases, so taking pictures and posting them online to compete is still the only recourse.
Fixes to the scoring are also inbound. Score inflation issues are to be patched soon.
Zero Gunner 2 Minus is our first exposure to this game in general, but it seems as if there have been a few hits to the game's overall presentation. There's definitely a lot of good here, but with some concessions due to the total rebuild of the game.
First up, the visuals are, at a glance, super sharp and well textured. Especially in the case of the backgrounds, most everything pops out and makes a great case for Zero Gunner 2 on the Switch. But when you get a little closer, the textures are a little muddy and there are times that the backgrounds and other elements show tears, which isn't really a huge deal for the most part, especially playing on the Switch in handheld mode.
The mechanical design for the player and enemy aircraft and surface-based vehicles is pretty great, featuring a number of real-world designs in addition to the more fantastical ones. That Ekranoplane on the sea stage? Pretty sweet. On the whole, the polygon count isn't especially high, but it's still pretty smooth. There are some effects that differ from the Dreamcast and Naomi versions though, especially when it comes to the helicopter rotors. They don't look quite as convincing in the Switch version, though still decent overall.
Likewise, a number of other effects like jet exhaust, water wake, and explosions are a bit off, but nothing that affects how well the game plays. When it behaves, of course. A number of scenes from the Dreamcast version are missing from this release though, which boils down, once again, to having needed to be remade entirely.
In terms of sound, Zero Gunner 2 Minus features the same music and effects found in the Dreamcast and Naomi versions. The OST is good, with a number of decent pieces that set the stage well, even if the instrumentation on the music feels a little more at home on the Super Famicom.
The sound effects also work well throughout the game too, though some, like in the main and meta option menus, are very harsh. Explosions and shots sound great, but some indicators like special weapons and the effects from collecting energy and power-ups sound less well sampled than we'd like.
Finally, all of the UI in Zero Gunner 2 Minus does a great job of keeping the play area clean and menus easy to navigate. It is a little jarring having the menu options appear on screen covering the whole playfield when paused though. It would have been better if a smaller sub-menu was used instead, keeping most of the playfield visible.
So, how does Zero Gunner 2 Minus stack up? Let's take a look.
Zero Gunner 2 is definitely not conventional when it comes to its controls, but it works very well.
Upcoming control patches will better balance the player's inputs.
Zero Gunner 2 Minus is very obviously easier than Zero Gunner 2 Naomi or Dreamcast, even at a glance. One credit clears can still take time though, especially on higher difficulties.
But this could make for a Zero Gunner 2 that anyone can play. It's still super fun after all.
Though it was fun enough for us to keep playing repeatedly, with 7 short stages and no extra modes outside of harder difficulties, there's not a ton to play in Zero Gunner 2 Minus.
If the second loop is truly accessible, it will make for a much lengthier playtime.
Zero Gunner 2 is pretty sharp in-game, though some textures are muddy and blurry, along with some of the text.
Some effects aren't quite as good as the Dreamcast or Naomi versions, but the mechanical design is still tops.
A decent OST and good sound effects make for a good sounding game overall.
Some of the menu sounds are a bit on the hard side, but otherwise work.
Having never played Zero Gunner 2, the Switch version definitely shows us why it has been so loved in the past.
Even though it misbehaves from time to time, the highly innovative control scheme is great and works well, having come from a pre-twin stick era.
All of the issues with the current release of Zero Gunner 2 Minus are almost forgivable because of its excellent price. Zero Gunner 2 Minus is only $8.
When you look at the Dreamcast's super high prices, often exceeding $200, the value here is pretty clear, even if it is easier and not quite identical.
Zerodiv has definitely got it going on. There may have been some issues with Zero Gunner 2 Minus, but they're already being addressed and fixed. It doesn't take much to get Zero Gunner 2 Minus to behave once it acts up, and while it's not an exact port, it's still plenty fun, and something we've gone back to over and over again, unlike a certain other recent shooter. But seriously, Zero Gunner 2 Minus gets a 4.25 out of 5. You can get your copy of Zero Gunner 2 Minus on the Nintendo eShop for about $8. You can really get into the zone with this one, huh? I definitely need to check out the other version too.
I don't know what zone you're talking about. This game hated me.
Well, maybe give it another go when this patch hits.
Maybe.